the soap maker of Correggio. In wartime Italy, a respected shopkeeper was hiding a horrifying secret. According to the evidence presented in court, Leonarda Cianciulli murdered 3 women and attempted to destroy their remains using caustic soda, producing what she described as soap. Investigators would later uncover evidence connecting the disappearances to her home. But this case is about more than its disturbing details. It is about how police uncovered the truth and how an ordinary neighborhood became the center of one of Italy's most extraordinary criminal investigations. Leonarda Cianciulli was born in Montella, in the province of Avellino, in what was then the Kingdom of Italy. Her early life provides little indication of the criminal case that would eventually make her infamous. In 1917, she married Raffaele Pansardi, a registry office clerk. The marriage was opposed by Cianciulli's mother, who had intended for her daughter to marry someone else. According to accounts later attributed to Cianciulli, she believed her mother had placed a curse upon the marriage. That belief would become important when investigators later examined her worldview and the explanations she gave for her actions. Cianciulli and Pansardi moved several times during their marriage. They lived in Lauria, where Cianciulli was convicted of fraud and imprisoned in 1927. After her release, the couple moved to Lacedonia. Then, following the 1930 earthquake in Irpinia, which destroyed their home, they relocated once again. This time they settled in Correggio, in the province of Reggio Emilia. There, Cianciulli opened a small shop. According to the source material, she became well known and respected within her neighborhood. That detail is important. Historical investigations frequently begin with an apparent contradiction between public reputation and private behavior. Cianciulli was not living as an isolated figure. She operated a business. She interacted with neighbors. People knew her. She was part of the local community. And yet, according to the historical record, events occurring inside that community would eventually lead to one of the most unusual criminal investigations in 20th century Italy. There was another important element of her personal history. Cianciulli experienced repeated pregnancy losses and the deaths of many of her children. According to the source, she had 17 pregnancies during her marriage. 3 ended in miscarriage. 10 of her children died while young. Only 4 survived. These experiences profoundly affected her relationship with her surviving children. The source describes her as intensely protective of them. Her fears were reinforced by beliefs she had developed earlier in life. A fortune teller had reportedly told her that she would marry and have children, but that her children would die young. She also reportedly consulted a Romani palm reader who told her that one hand indicated imprisonment and the other indicated a criminal asylum. Whether these predictions genuinely influenced her later behavior is difficult to establish objectively, but they were part of the belief system she later described, and that distinction matters. An investigation can document what a person believed. It cannot automatically establish that those beliefs caused later actions. By the late 1930s, Cianciulli was living in Correggio with her family and operating her shop. Then the international situation changed. Europe was moving toward another major war. Italy was preparing for conflict, and Cianciulli's eldest son, Giuseppe, was preparing to join the Royal Italian Army. According to the source material, Cianciulli became convinced that she needed to protect him. Her fears eventually developed into the belief that his safety required human sacrifices. That belief would become central to the explanation she later gave investigators. But the investigation itself would begin somewhere else. It would begin with 3 women, 3 neighbors, and a series of disappearances that initially appeared unrelated. The first was Faustina Setti. Setti was a lifelong unmarried woman who came to Cianciulli seeking assistance in finding a husband. Cianciulli told her that she knew of a suitable man in Pola. The opportunity apparently seemed credible enough that Setti prepared to leave, but Cianciulli instructed her not to tell others where she was going. She also persuaded Setti to prepare letters and postcards that could later be mailed to relatives and friends, creating the impression that she had safely arrived at her destination. This detail would become extraordinarily important to investigators later, because the investigation would eventually reveal that written communications could be used to create a false impression of someone's whereabouts. Setti visited Cianciulli one final time before her supposed departure. She never returned. At the time, however, her disappearance did not immediately expose a larger pattern. That would come later. The second woman was Francesca Soavi. Again, Cianciulli offered assistance. This time, she claimed to have found Soavi employment at a school for girls in Piacenza. Again, the woman was encouraged to prepare postcards describing her plans. Again, she came to Cianciulli's home before leaving. And again, she disappeared. The similarities between the cases would eventually become critical. But at this point, investigators did not yet have the complete picture. There was no obvious connection between the disappearances and a respected local shopkeeper. The third woman was Virginia Cacioppo, a widow who had previously worked as a singer. Cianciulli claimed to have found her employment as a secretary for an impresario in Florence. Once again, the woman was instructed not to tell anyone where she was going. Once again, she came to Cianciulli's home before the supposed departure, and once again, she disappeared. This time, however, someone noticed. Cacioppo's sister-in-law, Albertina Fanti, became suspicious. She had last seen Cacioppo entering Cianciulli's home. The disappearance concerned her enough that she contacted the superintendent of police in Reggio Emilia. That decision changed everything. For the first time, police had a specific individual to investigate. They had a missing woman, they had a last known location, and they had a witness who could connect the disappearance to another person. The investigation was about to begin. Investigators needed to determine whether physical evidence recovered from the property supported the accounts they had received. The source describes the discovery and examination of materials associated with the three women. The investigation also examined the methods Cianciulli reportedly used to dispose of their remains. Those details are part of the historical record, but the important investigative question is not the gruesomeness of the method. It is what those physical findings meant as evidence. Physical evidence can establish that an event occurred. It can help identify a victim. It can corroborate a confession. It can contradict a statement. And it can connect one location to multiple events. In Cianciulli's case, the physical evidence gave investigators another means of testing her statements. This is a crucial principle. A confession is evidence. But investigators should seek corroboration. If a suspect describes an event and investigators subsequently locate independent evidence consistent with that description, the evidentiary picture becomes stronger. The opposite is also true. If a confession contradicts established evidence, investigators have reason to question the account. The Cianciulli investigation therefore developed along several parallel tracks. Police reconstructed the disappearances. They examined communications. They investigated financial transactions. They questioned witnesses. They examined physical evidence. And they evaluated Cianciulli's own statements. The investigation was becoming increasingly comprehensive. But there remained another question. Why had these particular women become involved? And why had Cianciulli selected them? The source suggests that each woman was connected to a specific promise: marriage, employment, a new opportunity. The investigation, therefore, revealed something important about vulnerability. These women were not randomly encountered strangers. They were people seeking assistance with important personal circumstances. That context helped investigators understand how contact had been established. It also helped explain why the women had trusted Cianciulli. By the time investigators had assembled these elements, the case was no longer simply about one missing woman. It was a broader investigation into three connected disappearances, and the evidence was now sufficient to bring the case toward prosecution. The report from Albertina Fanti gave investigators something they had not previously possessed: a specific connection between a missing person and a particular location. Police began examining Cianciulli. The investigation quickly became more serious. Cianciulli was arrested, but the investigators faced a difficult question. What exactly had happened to Virginia Cacioppo? And was her disappearance connected to the earlier disappearance of Francesca Soavi or to Faustina Setti? The investigation could not simply assume that three disappearances represented one pattern. Investigators needed evidence. This distinction is fundamental to criminal investigation. A suspicion can begin an investigation. It cannot conclude one. Police began questioning Cianciulli. According to the source material, she did not immediately provide a full confession. Her position changed when investigators began considering whether her son, Giuseppe Panzardi, might somehow be implicated. At that point, Cianciulli provided detailed accounts intended to absolve her son from responsibility. Those statements became central to the investigation. Police now had an account from the person they suspected, but investigators still had to determine how much of that account could be independently verified. This is where the case became unusual. The investigation was not based solely upon a confession. Investigators also examined the physical environment, personal belongings, financial transactions, correspondence, and connections between the missing women. The victims had not simply vanished from an anonymous location. Each disappearance had a preceding story. Setti had been seeking a husband. Soavi had been seeking employment. Cacioppo had apparently been offered an opportunity in Florence. The offers gave each woman a reason to leave, and the instructions to send postcards or letters created an apparent explanation for their absence. For investigators, those communications became important evidence. A postcard could establish that a person had supposedly traveled, but investigators needed to determine who had actually written it, where had it originated, when had it been sent, and most importantly, was the information contained within it truthful? The investigation therefore moved beyond the question of what happened inside Cianciulli's home. It became a reconstruction of the victim's movements and communications. This is one of the most important aspects of historical detective work. Investigators often reconstruct events backward. They begin with the last confirmed fact. A person was seen entering a location. After that, the person disappeared. Investigators then work backward. Who contacted the person? What was discussed? What reason did the person have for being there? What communications followed? Who benefited financially? Who knew the person was planning to leave? Each question produces another. The investigators also examined Cianciulli's financial dealings. According to the source, she reportedly received money and valuables from the women. These transactions became another component of the evidence. But again, investigators had to establish the significance of each transaction. A financial transaction by itself does not prove a crime. It becomes meaningful when it can be connected to other independently established facts. In this case, investigators were gradually assembling several categories of information. There were missing persons, there were last known movements, there were communications, there were financial transactions, there was a common location, and there was a suspect who had known contact with all three women. The investigation was no longer dealing with isolated disappearances. It was dealing with a pattern. The next challenge was forensic. By the time Leonarda Cianciulli went to trial, investigators had assembled a case involving multiple forms of evidence. The trial took place in Reggio Emilia in 1946. The passage of time was significant. The murders had occurred during the final years of the Second World War. Italy itself had undergone enormous political and social upheaval. The country had experienced dictatorship, war, occupation, and civil conflict. Now the case entered the courtroom. The prosecution had to establish what had happened through evidence that could be examined judicially. Cianciulli's own statements were important, but the court also had access to physical evidence and testimony. The prosecution's case was therefore not simply a psychological portrait of the defendant. It was an evidentiary reconstruction. Three women had disappeared. Cianciulli had been connected to each. She had provided explanations for their departures. Evidence recovered during the investigation contradicted those explanations, and her own statements provided investigators with information concerning what had occurred. The courtroom became the place where those elements were tested. This is an important distinction between investigation and trial. Police investigators ask, what happened? Who was involved? What evidence can establish it? Prosecutors then ask, can those facts be demonstrated to the legal standard required by the court? The defense has the opportunity to challenge the evidence. Witness testimony can be questioned. Scientific conclusions can be examined. Documents can be challenged, and the defendant can provide her own account. The trial, therefore, represents a transition from investigative theory to legal judgment. The source describes Cianciulli as unrepentant during the proceedings. She reportedly corrected aspects of the official account while testifying. One particularly striking detail concerned a copper ladle that she said she had given to her country because Italy needed metal during the final years of the war. That statement illustrates something unusual about the defendant's presentation of herself. She did not simply deny everything. Instead, according to the historical account, she attempted to control the narrative surrounding her actions. For investigators and prosecutors, this created another challenge. Statements made by a defendant must be evaluated carefully. They may contain accurate information. They may contain exaggerations. They may contain attempts to justify behavior. They may contain false information. And they may contain information that only the person responsible for an event would reasonably know. The court ultimately found Cianciulli guilty. She received a sentence of 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. The sentence reflected the legal framework of post-war Italy and the court's findings. But the judicial outcome did not end the historical significance of the case. Cianciulli spent the remainder of her life within the prison and psychiatric system. She died in 1970 at the Women's Criminal Asylum in Pozzuoli. The case also left behind a collection of physical artifacts. Some of those objects were eventually preserved and placed on display at the Criminological Museum in Rome. From a historical perspective, these artifacts provide researchers with a tangible connection to the investigation, but their importance should be understood carefully. Objects associated with a criminal case can become symbols. They can acquire stories. They can become surrounded by myths. The role of the historian is to distinguish the object itself from the stories later attached to it. That principle applies to Cianciulli's case particularly well. The nickname "Soap Maker of Correggio" became famous. Her case attracted international attention. Newspapers emphasized unusual details. Later writers repeated those details. Eventually, the historical figure became intertwined with a much larger mythology. But the underlying investigation was considerably more complicated. It involved missing person reporting, police interviews, documentary evidence, financial investigation, physical evidence, forensic examination, witness testimony, a confession, and a judicial proceeding. That is the actual investigative structure. The sensational elements may attract attention, but they do not explain how the case was solved. The investigation began because someone noticed that a woman had disappeared. It developed because a relative reported her concerns. It expanded because investigators found connections. And it ultimately succeeded because multiple categories of evidence supported the prosecution. That is the part of the story that matters most for understanding criminal investigation. A crime does not become solved simply because investigators have a suspect. It becomes solved when the available evidence establishes what happened and can withstand scrutiny. The Cianciulli case also illustrates the limitations of the period. Investigators did not have modern DNA analysis. They did not have today's digital databases. They could not instantly compare fingerprints against international records. They could not reconstruct communications electronically. They depended upon witnesses, documents, physical evidence, and direct investigation. Yet the case demonstrates that careful investigative methods did not require modern technology. They required observation, documentation, corroboration, persistence, and the ability to connect apparently unrelated events. The trial, therefore, represents the culmination of an investigation that had begun with a single report of a missing woman. It ended with a conviction. But history continued to examine the case long after the courtroom proceedings ended. The conviction of Leonarda Cianciulli brought the criminal investigation to a legal conclusion. But it did not bring the historical story to an end. Cianciulli remained incarcerated for the rest of her life. She died in 1970 at the Women's Criminal Asylum in Pozzuoli. The case survived through documents, testimony, preserved objects, newspaper reports, and later historical accounts. And over time, another process began: the transformation of a criminal investigation into a historical legend. That transformation happens frequently. A case begins with evidence. Then newspapers report it. Later writers repeat the story. Details become simplified. Descriptions become more dramatic. Nicknames become more memorable than facts. And eventually, the public may remember the mythology more clearly than the investigation that produced it. Cianciulli's case is an excellent example. The nickname associated with her became widely known. The unusual nature of the evidence attracted attention. Later, artistic works were created about the case. But for historians and investigators, the more important questions are different. How was the investigation initiated? Why did authorities become suspicious? What evidence connected the three disappearances? How were statements evaluated? What role did physical evidence play? And what ultimately convinced the court? Those questions allow us to move beyond sensationalism. They also provide a broader lesson about criminal investigation. The first lesson is the importance of reporting suspicious disappearances. The investigation began because a relative refused to ignore the disappearance of Virginia Cacioppo. Without that report, investigators may not have immediately examined the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. The second lesson is the importance of connections. One disappearance may appear isolated. Three similar disappearances involving the same person create a very different investigative picture. The third lesson is corroboration. Investigators did not have to depend upon one piece of evidence. They had statements, correspondence, financial information, witness testimony, physical evidence, and the defendant's own account. The strength of an investigation often comes from the convergence of independent evidence. The fourth lesson concerns historical context. Cianciulli's case occurred during a period of extraordinary instability. Italy was entering the Second World War. The country was experiencing enormous political and social changes. Communications and travel were affected by wartime conditions, and the criminal justice system was operating in a very different technological environment from today. Investigators therefore had to rely heavily upon traditional methods: interviews, paper records, physical searches, witnesses, handwritten reports, and forensic examination based upon the scientific knowledge available at the time. The case also demonstrates why historical investigators must be cautious with psychological explanations. Cianciulli offered her own explanations for what she believed she was doing. Her beliefs concerning fortune-telling, curses, family protection, and sacrifice became part of the historical record. But an investigator must distinguish between a person's explanation for their behavior and an independently established explanation of that behavior. Those are not necessarily the same thing. The same principle applies to later interpretations. A person can become famous for a particular characteristic. That does not mean every story subsequently told about that person is historically reliable. This is especially important when examining cases that have been repeated for decades. The further removed we become from the original investigation, the greater the danger that fact and folklore will merge. That is why primary documents matter, court records matter, police reports matter, contemporary newspapers matter, and first-hand testimony must be evaluated within its historical context. The case also demonstrates how ordinary environments can conceal extraordinary investigative problems. Cianciulli operated a small shop. She lived among neighbors. She was known within her community. The investigation did not begin with a dramatic discovery by a highly specialized forensic team. It began because someone became concerned about a missing relative. That is often how criminal investigations actually begin, not with certainty, with a question. Where is this person? Why have they not returned? Who saw them last? Who communicated with them? What was supposed to happen next? And what evidence can answer those questions? The investigation then develops step by step. Each answer produces another question. Each document leads investigators to another document. Each witness produces another lead. And eventually, a collection of apparently unrelated facts becomes a coherent evidentiary picture. That process is the real subject of this case, not the mythology, not the nickname, not the spectacle, the investigation. Leonarda Cianciulli died in 1970. The women whose disappearances initiated the investigation were no longer able to tell their own stories, but the historical record preserved enough information for investigators, courts, and later historians to reconstruct much of what occurred. There are still questions. There are always questions in historical criminal cases, but the broad investigative sequence is clear. A disappearance raised concern. A witness contacted police. Investigators identified a connection. A suspect was arrested. Evidence was collected. Statements were examined. The disappearances were connected. The case went to trial, and a court returned a conviction. That sequence is what makes the case valuable to students of criminal investigation. It demonstrates that solving a crime does not always depend upon advanced technology. Sometimes the essential tools are much simpler: a concerned relative, a police report, a photograph, a letter, a witness, a financial record, a careful interview, and an investigator willing to keep asking questions. The case of Leonarda Cianciulli remains disturbing because of what the evidence revealed. But it is historically significant for another reason. It shows how an investigation can transform scattered information into an evidentiary record. And it reminds us that when examining the darkest chapters of history, the most responsible approach is not to make the events more sensational. It is to understand them, to examine the evidence, to recognize uncertainty where uncertainty exists, and to remember the people whose lives were affected, rather than allowing the person responsible to become the center of the story. That is the purpose of historical criminal investigation. Not to create monsters, but to understand what happened, how it was discovered, what the evidence can actually tell us.